Okay, welcome to this webinar on the much anticipated book, Symbolic Objects and Contentious Politics. And we have our two authors, Peter Gardner and Benjamin Abrams with us. Peter from York and Benjamin from London. I'm David Swartz from Boston University, and I confess at the outset that I have never guided one of these webinars before. I've participated in many Zooms, so you can anticipate many errors and mistakes on my part through this session. Just brief introduction for Benjamin. He's the Leverhulme Trust Fellow in Politics and Sociology at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. He's the editor-in-chief of Contention, the multidisciplinary journal of social protest. Peter is a lecturer in Department of Sociology at University of York. His interests are in ethnic studies, language, politics, peace, conflict studies, and contentious politics. Received his PhD from Department of Sociology, University of Cambridge. I'm reading from the short bios that they provided me that will appear in the book. The book is due out in April 2023, open access University of Michigan Press on our side of the pond. Congratulations on being accepted in a very fine press. I look forward to reading the book. We will start without further ado. If Peter and Benjamin want to do some further brief and personal introductions, now's the time to do that. They will then present the work for, say, 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A, and I will re-intervene then at this point. And according to my tally, we have 61 participants in the webinar. So Peter and Benjamin, take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. And indeed for the kind words about the book, much appreciated. From the outset, just some kind of initial acknowledgements, just to say that we're deeply thankful not only to the ECPR for hosting this, but also to the British Sociological Association for funding some of the kind of early seed conferences that gave rise to this project, and also to the Economic and Social Research Council and the Leverhulme Trust for their support of our research over the years. And finally, to the universities of Aberdeen, York, and indeed UCL, for all their help along the way. And so to get things started, I'm just going to kind of ask a simple question, and it's rhetorical, so you don't need to think about an answer. But if I said to you, what is going on in this picture, and you can get a bit of a better sense of it if we get to the next slide as well, you'd probably respond, oh, that's a kind of guy with an umbrella. But actually, most people then say, oh, he seems to be at some kind of protest. And all the objects that we see fade away into the background. They might be eye-catching temporarily, but what we describe is protest. But if we look a little bit closer at this picture, we can see there's some actually very interesting objects which have had very prominent roles throughout the history of protests. And so you can see up in the top corner, there's a Confederate statue. We might remember those from some of the Black Lives Matter protests of a couple of years ago, being torn down or covered in paint or daubed in blood or all sorts of other stuff. You can see the red-shirted protester there. That's a kind of famous symbol from the Thai coup in 2006. You might note that the umbrella was yellow, as indicated by the kind of Hong Kong umbrella revolution in 2014, and other various objects like Egyptian flags, the white anonymous mask, and for those of you who are especially kind of history buffs, the Biafran Red Devil tank. And so all of these are what we call symbolic objects. And the basic mission of this entire talk is to make one simple point, essentially, which is people do enact protests, but they do so with these objects. They do so with symbolic objects. And I think before I speak to this, just if we could switch to the next slide, that'd be great. And what we see when we look at processes, yes, lots and lots of human bodies, but most of them are carrying things or adorning their bodies in certain ways that make them symbolic. But symbolic objects, this is kind of a bit of a neologism. Some people have used it before, but in quite vague ways. So I think it's useful to begin by just expressing clearly what we mean when we use the term. And as we can see on the next slide, symbolic objects are material things that have the potential to be physically expressive, right? That is to say, something can do something to someone else, either by action or by its physical presence. We might think, for example, of a flag hoisted above an embassy, right? That's clearly a symbolic object. It's not there for its properties as a piece of cloth. It's kind of physically expressing something by its presence. In slightly more academic legalese, as we'll have on the next slide, is the fact that symbolic objects are essentially containers for multiple meanings, declarations, stories, and other elements of what we would call kind of the symbolic structure of reality, or kind of cultural stuff. And they get imbued with these various meanings, declarations, stories, and other things over time. They might take on meanings because of an instance of protest. They might take on meanings because of their relevance to the state. But what these meanings do is they give these objects power to essentially reify abstract ideas, right? And so what we see is we see situations in which in one single strip of fabric, you could contain, for example, the nation, right? This notion of the national community. And this, funnily enough, connects to how we both came to this topic. And I'm going to hand over to Pete to talk to that first, and then I'll come back in.
Yeah, so we thought it'd be interesting to, at this point, kind of give a little bit of background into how we both came to this subject. And so, you know, my interest in the subject really began quite early. I grew up in Northern Ireland. I was born, you know, towards the end of the 80s, the middle of the Northern Irish conflict. And although shootings, bombs, demonstrations, paramilitary presence, peace talks, and other kind of signs of civil conflict were always there in the background, these weren't really part of daily experience. This was something that happened now and again, or showed up on the TV screen. There's an element to which some of it was slightly abstracted. And even in communication with people in every day, you know, you never mentioned identity. You couldn't really talk about politics. We were all kind of taught not to speak about identities or about politics. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, put this quite accurately in his poem, Whatever You Say, Say Nothing, where he says, smoke signals are loud-mouthed compared with us, maneuverings to find out name and school, subtle discrimination by address, with hardly an exception to the rule, that Norman, Ken, Sydney were signalled fraud, and Seamus, call me Shane, was surefire Pape. O land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, of open minds as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled as under flames lie wicks, besieged within the siege, whispering Morse. And this poem really speaks to my own experience, even doing PhD research in Northern Ireland, where to actually talk about these things was something that people find extremely uncomfortable. And so physical violence itself was something kind of a little bit abstracted, a bit far off. Even speaking aloud about the things that we're experiencing was something that was problematic, or something that we couldn't really do. But the manifestation of war that was present on a daily basis took the form of physical objects charged with intense symbolic importance. As you can see on this street of Northern Ireland, that's a fairly normal street, flags everywhere. And these flags, bonfires, painted curbs, painted murals, all seem to me to house the deeply held emotions of anger, of pain, of oppression, defense, victimhood, senses of victimhood. And inscribed upon these symbols, sometimes even physically inscribed, were forms of militancy, religiosity, histories of death, memorials of past revolutions, and hopes for future ones. And so in Northern Ireland, it really is impossible ignore symbolic objects. So when it came to starting to study contentious politics specifically at grad school, it was quite surprising to me that the lack of consideration given to things in contentious politics. So I began discussing these things with Ben and also with Tiago Carvalho, who also has contributed a chapter to the volume. And from there, we started to think a little bit more about what we might want to do, essentially to try to push the discipline, I guess, or the sub-discipline towards kind of recognition of the importance of these things. I'll pass on to Ben again at this point.
Yeah, and so over the next couple of, if you just look to the next slide, you'll see an instance of kind of how important these flags can be, right? So our initial thinking was we would do something pretty much just about flags. We wanted a discrete, limited contribution that kind of opened a crack through which we could begin to explore the world of symbolism, objects, and contention. And so we got together, the three of us, and we wrote a paper called Flags in Social Protest, or FISP, as we like to pronounce it. We still have a draft up somewhere on one of our research gates, if any of you are curious. And we sent it round the shops, and we got various pieces of feedback. But one of the key things was that our approach, which was to try and devise a specific sociology of flags and how they're used in protest, what we termed at the time quite seriously Vexillo sociology, was in fact a bit of a highly specific venture, and maybe wouldn't be of interest to a wider audience. And so the feedback we got was, why don't you go away and think about how this can apply to a broader set of objects, not just flags, because unfortunately not everyone cared as much about flags as Pete and myself. And so we did that, but we soon realized that we needed to speak with a vastly larger group of people than just the three of us, myself, Pete, and Tiago. And so we talked to the BSA, and they arranged to fund a conference up at the University of Aberdeen called Symbolic Objects in Contentious Politics. And we had an absolutely tremendous get together, really. I mean, ideas were absolutely just swimming around, and many of the people who went to the conference were contributors to the book, but others who were involved also kind of helped our ideas mature. And so after that, we realized that we were really onto something, but we couldn't do it alone. And so the idea of an edited volume with a discrete theoretical contribution, but a large host of empirical exemplifications, case studies, and kind of sets of ideas was born. And fortunately, Michigan Press were keen as well. And so the project began. I'm going to pass back over to Pete now.
Yeah, so moving on to the book itself. So our focus in the book really is on the roles that symbolic objects play in contentious politics, and the relationship between the two. So, repertoires in contentious politics theory refers to various different forms of action that can be taken by actors and groups, and we're kind of keen to really push the point that it's not just that symbolic objects are the physical stuff of repertoires. It kind of moves significantly beyond that. So a material culture approach to the subject would basically take into consideration all forms of materiality at work here. And we think that's a really interesting and potentially fruitful agenda. It's just not exactly what we're trying to do. Our focus was really on those objects that come to be highly symbolically charged and are kind of really important for forms of protest and other forms of contention. Basically, our primary interest is more on the second half of the title of the book. It's on contentious politics. So we're interested in trying to explain contentious politics, its causation and outcomes and so on, rather than materiality itself. And as I said, as far as Ben and I could see it, the contentious politics literature was basically showing very little curiosity about that role. The roles that symbolic objects were playing. And if it featured at all, it was kind of fairly cursory. So we began to think about putting this together as a book in order to basically showcase what could potentially be done with this kind of approach, but also to suggest kind of further avenues for research and consideration and theorization. So from the material culture studies, we know that objects have biographies, they've got life histories and life courses, and those histories matter to the social function of that object. And what an object does in a space is not neutral or predictable, and its interpretation is multiple and dynamic. And so, within contentious political events, symbolic objects clearly are playing roles beyond even what the person carrying or using the object is kind of intending for it. It ends up doing more than that. We also think, though, that contentious politics is a really interesting moment for meaning creation. It's often a really hot moment for meaning creation, that meanings suddenly become attached very quickly to objects. And Sarah Ahmed, in her book, Cultural Politics of Emotion, talks about sticky objects and objects becoming sticky in particular situations, making for sticky objects. And a sticky object being an object or a thing where feelings, emotions, ideas, perceptions of reality, arguments, and various other things become stuck to the object, such that interpretation gets entangled. And it just seemed to us really interesting that contentious politics, gives rise to these events where objects become significantly stickier. The picture that you can see here, some people may be more or less aware of some of the events going on at the minute with Just Stop Oil in the UK. But there's been a variety of very high-profile forms of protest against the licensing of new oil and gas. Over 100 new oil and gas drilling sites by the UK government. And so there are climate-based environmental movements attempting to reverse that decision. And this is one of their actions. They decided to go into a museum, pour some soup over Van Gogh's sunflowers. And this got massive publicity, huge discussion on the news, on Twitter and so on, huge backlash, as well as huge amount of support. The painting itself is fine, it was behind glass, but it gave rise to a huge amount of discussion. And this alongside various other forms of protests are going on at the minute. At the weekend, I myself was taking my 3-year-old child to York Train Museum, and I had my bag searched. And I asked why they were searching my bag. They told me they were looking for super glue, orange paint, or a can of soup. And it's very interesting that those are 3 extremely arbitrary objects that wouldn't really have any meaning in it, the same associations anyway, meaning 1, 2, 3 years ago, whereas now they are highly contentious objects, and have become sticky objects with global warming, climate anxiety, protests, reaction and counter-reaction attached to them. So our overall aim really for the book is to essentially kickstart this kind of focus within social movement studies and put forward some parameters for the study of symbolic objects in contentious politics. And so we're now going to turn to some of the parameters that we put forward in the book. So one of those sets of parameters is target, component, and stimulus. So symbolic objects in their many different forms feature as targets of components in or stimuli for contentious political struggles. And first we're looking at a target. So it can be a target or indeed the target of collective action, often these kinds of objects. So various things can act as a focus for contention. They aren't always symbolically important at the time that they are approached or targeted, but often get new meanings attached to them through that. At times they're targeted because they are they have large symbolic importance. We can think of, for example, contentious statues. This is the picture of the toppling of Edward Carson, his statue being thrown into the sea in Bristol during the BLM protests in 2020. We can think about flags such as the Confederate flag in the US as being a target. But this kind of protest is also far from new. During the 1525 Peasants' War in Lower Saxony, the great libraries and archives of Catholic monasteries and abbeys became the target for bands of peasants in revolt. Feudal charters and tax rolls that functioned as the legal basis for the maintenance of serfdom were destroyed, burned, or even used as stepping stones for peasants along a muddy path, literally trampling on the old order. So symbolic objects are targeted in various different forms of contentious politics, not just in protests. We see this in terrorism, such as the targeting of the World Trade Center in 9/11. We see it in armed insurrections, such as the bombing of the Temple of the Tooth in the city of Kandy during the Sri Lankan Civil War. And it's not just about destruction either. We also see restorations as a target. Such as the 2012 Belfast City Hall protest, which aimed at restoring a flag upon the City Hall. So, secondly, we see symbolic objects as components in contentious politics. And we've basically observed these everywhere we look in all forms of contention. They're held up, they are gestured with, they're worn, they're stood upon, sheltered underneath, they're revealed, produced, utilized in a plethora of other ways as well that give rise to ways of, forms of declaration making and statement making. So here we see placards during Occupy and flags at an anti-Brexit march. We can think of, this is Captain Hobbs in Tunisia in 2012, who, against the kind of the might of the Tunisian police and army, used a baguette and photographed himself, had himself photographed to kind of illustrate, I guess, the might of the state, but also the confidence of the people. It's jokey as well. It's kind of doing something interesting in relation to the state that is repressing them. We see this in highly artistic forms of protest, like in Extinction Rebellion in 2019, this is London, where the people's future, the future of humanity, was given a burial, a coffin carried through the streets of London. So we see these everywhere. A third component here is objects as stimuli for contentious action, and we think this is a really interesting dimension of symbolic objects as well. So Sid Taro, speaking of words rather than objects, describes how contentious language is not only expresses mobilization, but also stimulates emotions and drives episodes of contention. So symbolic objects can do the same. Tobias Carroll, in his book on political signs and objects, talks about how having this particular, that isn't the correct button, but having a protest button in his bedroom growing up, it influenced his politics. Even though he didn't actually really understand the slogan that was on the political button, it made him think in a political way and consider protest the kind of part of his everyday thinking. We also know, although we couldn't really find much research on it, we know, at least anecdotally, that many flags, banners, protest placards, and so on end up in people's bedrooms or houses or front rooms after protest. Even think about people's protest marching shoes, that they come to symbolize something when they're beyond the protest, after the protest, and then can also give rise to other forms of contentious action and involvement as well. So overall, we see symbolic objects as generally acting as either target, component, or stimulus in contention. I'm going to hand over to Ben to continue this.
Yeah, and with regards to this particular triad, one thing that's worth noting is that an object can go through all three stages. So one example we have in the book that we quite like is that during the Arab Spring, anti-government protesters stormed the Kuwaiti parliament, and they steal the speaker's gavel, which is supposed to be used to rule over parliamentary procedure. And this initially is the target of a protest. But this then becomes a kind of symbolic trophy used by protesters in Kuwait. And so it gets reproduced in kind of blown up large copies. It's displayed during rallies. People even have ones in their house. And it becomes this kind of component in future protests. But there's also then this pledge, which is eventually made, that they will return the gavel in 2020 if things in the country turn to their liking. And so it then becomes also a stimulus for further contentious action. And so an object's position in these three categories can definitely change. We're not saying that they are mutually exclusive over time. It's rather that these are kind of three classic roles that objects tend to fall into. And speaking of the way in which objects play roles, one big question for us was the question of potency. Namely, how potent are symbolic objects? What do these things actually do? Are they causally effective? Are they powerful in a certain way? Do they affect people in a positive or a negative fashion? How do we actually gauge this? How do we get at this question of power relations with these objects rather than just analyze their kind of symbolic and material attributes in a vacuum? And so here we kind of came to the conclusion that symbolic objects can do a number of different things. On the one hand, they can make declarations, they can represent constituencies, attract attention, inspire responses, stigmatize or legitimize actions, afford authority, vulnerability, or other reputational attributes. But on the other, they can do none of these things. They can be very, very minimally potent. And to try and understand this, we derive two or three notions: symbolic importance, relatedly, the idea of banal and charged objects, which I'll also discuss, and the material capacity of objects. And the first of these is symbolic importance. And so we have two examples here that might help you make sense of this. On the one hand, you have the World Trade Center on September 10th, 2001. On the other hand, you have a red T-shirt. On September 10th, 2001, the World Trade Center already had a great deal of symbolic importance. It was used in almost every shot of the skyline of New York. It was indicative of the power of American industry, and it was highly sought after by the business and political elites of the country. People wanted to have their office in WTC, or they wanted to be able to say they'd gone for a meeting down there. It was the pearl of the financial district. By contrast, the day before the Thai coup protests, well, not the day before, but the period before the Thai coup protests in 2006, a red T-shirt was just a red T-shirt. If you had a red T-shirt in your house, no one would assume that you were planning anything particularly political or that you had any kind of political intent. They might assume it was a football supporting kind of scenario, and you were going to wear your T-shirt to a game or something. But they probably wouldn't have thought that you were a supporter of one of the factions in the Thai coup. And so this notion of symbolic importance refers to basically the pre-existing meanings and understandings that are attached to an object at the point of its involvement in contentious politics. But this is only one dimension, and it's important to note that symbolic importance can be affected by whether an object is more banal or is highly charged. And as an example of the distinction between banal and charged objects, I chose two very similar symbols that had two very different kind of states, if you will. So a banal object is an object that's kind of taken for granted, something which is more or less unremarkable in the context of a given form of contention or a given political scenario. Their presence may be commonly overlooked. A placard at a protest is quite banal. A flag at a protest can be quite banal. In fact, a flag hanging from a building can also be considered quite banal. But in other circumstances, these objects can take on this kind of social energy. They can attract attention. They can inspire controversy. And sometimes it's just a matter of situating the object in a different context. So here we have, for example, two cases of a hammer and sickle. The first is a hammer and sickle press in Stalin's bunker. In this particular case, a hammer and sickle in Stalin's bunker is not really making a grand political statement, certainly not more than the one of Stalin being in his bunker would. By contrast, this framed hammer and sickle in the bar of King's College, Cambridge, inspired a great deal of controversy many, many times over about a 10-year period. This related to the notion that the bar might have been celebrating genocide by having a communist flag, notion that the bar might have been endorsing Russia's invasion of Ukraine by having a communist flag, and the notion that the bar might have been endorsing one particular interpretation of the Soviet rule, which was the Khrushchev era, because the flag bore particular resemblance to Khrushchev's adopted flag. In fact, for completeness, it's worth noting that this is not in fact a flag at all. It is a piece of red canvas with a hammer and sickle drawn in Microsoft Paint printed on it, and actually doesn't properly resemble any of the flags ever used, but it was interpreted by this, and its position in a gilded frame gave it a certain degree of charged element. This was eventually removed owing to the fact that people felt so strongly affected by it, not because the particular bar in question objected to the politics attached to the symbol, but because it was so charged that it was causing fights among people attending it. And so this distinction, you would think, oh, charged objects, maybe they're just more powerful than banal objects. It's not quite the case, right? The thing about a banal object is it can go unquestioned, it can linger. There's this kind of great quote by Miller that says, the less aware we are of these objects, the more powerful they can determine, the more powerfully they can determine our expectations by setting the scene and ensuring appropriate behavior without being open to challenge. And so banal versus charged is much more about challengeability than it is about power, but it mediates the way in which symbolic importance gets interpreted and gets responded to. This then brings us to the third aspect, which is about material capacity. And the material capacity of objects is kind of what you'd expect. It's what you can do with them or what they do. For example, if we have the first example, our Dragunov rifle, that's a very, very materially capable object. You can end people's lives with it. You can intimidate people with it. You can hold it above you to signal your power. And consequently, objects with this kind of material capacity are actually often prescribed in societies or tightly controlled. Similarly, we can think about things like buildings, right? If you control a building, you have a great deal of power. The material capacity of a building is, in fact, rather great, particularly if you can do things with other objects like planes, for example, and fly them into buildings. The combination of these objects, immense material capacity, hence we have a great security apparatus around them to stop people from doing things with them, like blowing up the buildings, firing the rifle, etc. By contrast, objects with limited material capacity, say, for example, our tin of paint or of tomato soup, are relatively freely available. And so in these contexts, they're quite often used in protest. Often you'll see people adopting or adapting objects which are relatively low capacity, but freely available, and maybe heightening their symbolic importance, as in the case of throwing tomato soup over Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers, which of course then makes the tomato soup take on this symbolic value that causes people like Pete to be searched when he goes to the train museum, or alternatively, using them in ways that one wouldn't expect. We can think about, for example, the Hong Kong protests, where things like hard hats and goggles become riot gear for protesters. And so often we see this situation where the majority of contention involving symbolic objects is objects relatively low material capacity with amplified symbolic importance. But the ones that really make the news are often where people gain control of a highly materially capable object or a highly materially powerful object, and use that to stage elaborate, often traumatic displays that can affect the psyche of not just an entire nation, but sometimes the world, as we saw with the 9/11 attacks, which completely reoriented global politics. And so these were the kind of dimensions that we use to understand this phenomenon, think through it a bit more carefully.
So I'm aware we're probably about 10 minutes left to speak, and we want to give a bit more of an overview of the book itself, because we have I think we both were saying the other day, we're really proud of the contributions that we have in the book. I think it's really interesting set of cases and case studies from Europe, Africa, Asia, North and South America, Middle East. It's a really interesting set of objects and set of perspectives in the book, we think. So jumping ahead of both of my, Ben and my contributions, much of which we've actually covered already, we have chapter 2, which is Bartosz Zazarski, and his chapter is entitled "The Strategic Toolbox of Symbolic Objects, Material Artifacts, Visuality and Strategic Action in European Street Protest Areas." It kicks off the kind of case studies for the book. And in this chapter, Zazarski contends that the symbolic objects that are available to a movement constitute basically a toolbox from which contentious performers can draw and do so in order to try to achieve their specific set goals. So examining the role of banner making as a method of increasing visibility for the causes of Polish and German social movements, the chapter explores ways in which symbolic objects function both as material tools and as symbolic active mediators of human and social interaction. And basically this gives rise to an array of strategic dilemmas for protesters and for activists as how to use objects, what objects to use, and they need to therefore make a range of decisions around what to do, how and when. And so he argues essentially that while the scope of potential objects that make up a movement's strategic toolbox can be, in theory at least, limitless, obviously also restricted by certain economic and political factors, in practice it's much more constrained because of the strategic dilemmas that they have to try to overcome in order to try to make their case. Ben, I'll hand back to you for the next chapter.
Yeah, so to give you kind of context as to how we organized the book, we've basically organized the bulk of the book into 3 sections. These concern first the creation of symbolic objects, that's the section we're looking at now, then the potency of symbolic objects, these cases where we were particularly interested in developing this concept of potency discussed earlier, and finally the legacy of symbolic objects, and that's the section where we looked a bit more in detail about how these symbolic objects played out over time. These are kind of longer running configurations. As with all books, of course, each chapter speaks to all of these in some regard, but we organize them according to their principal focus. And so chapter 3 is by Jonas Saramafar, which is a really interesting ethnographic exploration of the materiality of martyrdom in Iran and its connections to Shia religiosity and contentious politics. And the really, really fascinating element that I think came out in Jonas's chapter was that symbolic objects weren't just about contention from the perspective of protest movements and states, but also interstate contention and state-led contention. And Iran was a really brilliant case study to draw this out, looking at how the use of objects in kind of everyday life facilitated a certain economy and social production of martyrdom and of the pursuit of the politics of the Iranian government and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, extending to things like the war in Syria and historically back to the Iran-Iraq War. And so this kind of showed us how and why certain objects came into being in this Iranian context. And actually that it wasn't by coincidence that they took on important value and roles in propagating this particular culture of martyrdom, this kind of form of contention, which in most of the rest of the world is not seen so prominently as part of the apparatus of the state. And I think one of the things that if you take a look at the book, what you'll see is one of the things that Jonas draws out really brilliantly in this chapter is that this is something which permeates social life. There are regular events at which martyrs are celebrated and their images are fixed onto certain objects. One great example he uses is the example of a man who sells cardboard cutouts of martyrs, but is always sure to take a photo of the purchaser with said cardboard cutout, so that he can, should the purchaser also be martyred, repurpose the photo to produce new cardboard cutouts for a new generation of martyrs. The next chapter, chapter 4, by John Nagel, similarly considers the way in which symbolic objects manifest in specific cultural scenarios and how these cultural scenarios can be quite particular in determining the efficacy of objects. And so in particular, John Nagel's chapter looks at the role of cultural mores in mediating the kinds of objects that will present in protest. He draws on the example of the LGBT flag, something that we kind of associate with the worldwide kind of pro-queer equality movement, so to speak. But actually, in Lebanon, the use of a flag is something that seems quite distinctly indicative of a Western NGO Stonewall era activism. And so Lebanese activists opted to use graffiti instead, something that was much more familiar to contentious political causes in the country, to express their allegiance with this movement and their beliefs, trying to kind of domesticate the way in which protest was symbolized. And it's a really, really fascinating chapter as well. I mean, I could say that about all of these, but it's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to pass over to Pete now to talk about some more.
Yeah, so in the next chapter, Sonia Dabrowski gives us a really detailed historical analysis of the use of the feathered headdress in the US. And as an object, you know, but pre-colonization of the US, there were a huge variety of different headdresses used for a lot of different things, from the everyday to the highly symbolic, and this kind of cultural complexity basically got absorbed into the settler colonial narrative, and absorbed into US national myth and used in a variety of different ways. We can think of the Boston Tea Party during the American Revolution, where settler revolutionaries donned the feathered headdress in undertaking that contentious political act. We can also think about contention around the Kansas City Chiefs football team wearing the war bonnet. It's kind of a bastardized version of a highly charged object that new meanings have become associated with as it becomes colonized. One of the really interesting arguments really that Sonia makes in this chapter is basically around how forms of contention using the feathered headdress by the settler population was very much at the expense of the space in which Native American contention could take place. So the next, we're moving on to the next section, which is about potency, and chapter 6, with three scholars, Goya Carnot, Tiago Carvalho, and Pedro Ramos Pinto, talk about the street in Portugal and how the street during the revolution came to basically be an object, a thing that symbolized freedom of expression, symbolized democracy, but also symbolized the left. And so in their chapter, they follow the street and the meaning of the street in Portuguese contention through into the 21st century, especially focusing on Portuguese anti-austerity struggles, where the street again played a huge role as a positive aspect, but then also into COVID-19 lockdown protests, in which the positive connotations of the street were temporarily supplanted.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up these next set of chapters. So this whole section really is about exploring the potency of symbolic objects beyond the kind of theoretical discussion that we give in our chapters. And so just as how we saw in Portugal, where after the revolution, people weren't able to have a permanent representative in the democratic parliament, so they were able to use the street as the kind of vessel for democratic representation instead. Here we see another case in which the potency of symbolic objects is maybe a little different than we would expect. And so Hunter Duke's chapter called Signature Performance Contention looks at the intersection of contentious performances and signed objects and the act of signing objects. And the idea that Duke's advances in his chapter is that there is a form of conjunction in which symbolic objects meanings can be changed and altered. So by affixing a signature to a pair of goggles, this example actually aren't from the Hong Kong protest, but this was done frequently in the Hong Kong protest by prominent cantopop celebrity Denise Ho, who would sign people's goggles and sign people's phones, trying to kind of imbue them with her endorsement, but also her kind of symbolic protection. This interestingly ends up with Ho being arrested herself for this kind of symbolic complicity in protest. But the point of this whole chapter, really through an array of really fascinating case studies, looks at how actually just the act of signing an object can really alter and transform its symbolic properties, which then give rise to new uses in contentious politics. Similarly, there's a second chapter, chapter 8 by Valery Zawilski, which looks at a similar process, the way in which bodies can be adorned or altered by the process of bodywork. Think wearing particular uniforms or clothes, piercing or dyeing, or potentially embodying a kind of alternative lifestyle. So kind of having a body that is very visibly genderqueer, or that is very visibly modified in some way. And how actually these modifications had certain meaning, yes, for the protagonists in protest, but also antagonists and state forces were doing the same thing. They were applying their own interpretive lens to these transformations and using them as pretext for repression, measures of people's potential hostility towards the state. And this is a really interesting chapter, I think, because it flips the analytical lens, right? So often we are aligned with activists or other contentious protagonists in our research, and we take things from their point of view. What Zawilski does is looks at how the police behaved, right? So it kind of changes that lens. I'm going to pass back now to Pete.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things that came out of our discussions, we think, is how moments in protest can transform the body itself into a symbolic object and a kind of important object in forms of protest. And we see this again in Dennis Leo's chapter, The Body on Fire. And basically he talks about self-immolation, the history of self-immolation in contention, and basically how the body then becomes this body on fire, which itself is a kind of object outside of the individual. We see this in the famous self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc in Vietnam in 1963, whose act sparked visceral reaction, not only globally, but also internal resistance within Vietnam. But then also we're thinking about stimulus, symbolic object of stimulus. Zio points to the depiction of Thich Quang Duc on the cover of the album Rage Against the Machine, the self-titled album in the 90s, and how this then also inspired and invigorated new forms of activism and resistance to oppression. We then move on to legacy, and I'm aware of the time. We are getting quite close to the end here. And Eric Sylvan's chapter here really starts us off where he talks about Che Guevara and how El Che, the symbol of El Che, it comes to be basically a symbolic object that's invoked around the world against state institutions, structures that dominate and oppress people, and even are able to kind of be used, the kind of object, the figure of Che in its various different forms, to use to deconstruct or even reconstruct implicit images of and ideas about the society in which a group lives and the makeup of their social environment. And basically, Eric does a fantastic job of grappling with the complexity of the simultaneously chargedness and banalness of Che, basically, as a figure. And back to Ben to finish up.
And so, yeah, one of the things that's really fascinating about kind of when we explore symbolic objects legacies is that more often than not, there is this ubiquity of industrial production that a particularly potent symbol can undergo. So you see it with El Che, right? A symbolic object involving El Che isn't just his visage, it's a mug, it's a watch, it's a t-shirt. There's a great anecdote in relation to Eric's chapter about Colombian guerrillas who all wear Che Guevara t-shirts, and this is how they're successfully infiltrated by the nation's government. In the case of this chapter by Dilar Derek, we're looking at shoes, in particular the Mecca, a quote-unquote terrorist shoe, according to the Turkish government. And Dilar's chapter looked at how processes of stigmatization enforced on certain banal objects associated with, say, an ethnic group like the Kurds can be combated. And how these groups can in fact reclaim them, and this whole process of symbolic contestation, how it plays out. And DLR's example, I think, is really important because we often see, as in the case of the feather headdress from earlier chapters, and in the case of bodywork in Valery Zawilski's chapter, how state forces can often affect stigmatizing interpretations of objects. And so DLR's chapter shows us that there is a potential hope for their reclamation. And in the case of the MECAP, it was exceedingly successful. The next chapter looks at the legacies of object from a different perspective. This is leaving the context of protest and moving more particularly into war proper. And so Scholastica and Okunle's chapter on biafran war artifacts really shows in, I think, very stark detail how objects from past contentious episodes can play this vital role in the fabric of social life in areas like Biafra. They can not only replicate memories and sustain these kind of emotional touchstones, but they can then be redeployed to trigger new collective action. And so having these objects around, not just in the sense of having a placard in your room, but having a tank on your doorstep, potentially around the corner, can remind you of, for example, what has been lost in the past and what might be potentially reclaimed, or at least what could be contested. I dare say Pete also has some reflections on this from his experience growing up in Northern Ireland. And then for the final chapter, I'm going to hand back to Pete, who's also going to discuss some future directions.
Yes, so I think given the time, I'll wrap up just after this chapter. But yeah, the final chapter before Ben and I conclude and talk about some future directions for the research is by Thomas and Risgaard, and it's talking about the mask. Essentially as a political tool, and they talk about how mask wearing basically allows those who are engaged in contentious politics to make distinctive kinds of social representations about political power. And through the use of masks, protesters can construe relationships to power that differ from the mask wearer's own identity, and in so doing, simultaneously express contradictory attitudes towards power holders. Masks can not only erase individual differences and engender anonymity, but also superimpose new identities or theatrical representations upon the wearers themselves. I'm kind of aware we're over time, so I don't want to go on too much, but I can leave this up basically for us to discuss a little further. But basically, we conclude the book by kind of drawing a lot of the different strands of the book together and put forward 5 different areas that we think future research could go. And I'll leave these up so we can read them. But I'm aware we're over time, so I want to stop there and live for questions.
Yeah, one last thing we should do before we leave these up is also now do the first public reveal on the next slide of the book's cover, which you'll be able to see. You might notice a familiar object there. This will be making its rounds in print and open access, freely available to anyone, thanks to the kind funding of the University of Michigan Press in April of 2023. Obviously, if you're interested in any of the chapters or anything we've done, please do reach out to us. We can negotiate maybe the provision of some early material if you want to read it or learn more about it. Yeah, but coming back to the previous slide, these questions that we've got up here, these are really the questions we think we haven't answered yet, but we would love people to answer with us. And so we are trying to build a broader network and think about doing future special issues or even gatherings or workshops on this topic. And we're really excited to, I think, kind of bring this forward and keep building that community of scholars. But without any further ado, I think we'll pass over to David for the Q&A.
So Pete and Ben, thank you very much for this is very interesting presentation, outlining both your motivations for getting into this project at the outset, how your thinking has developed over time, the various classifications, dimensions, categories relative to symbolic objects that you've made, and then discussing the various chapters, or briefly discussing the various chapters in the book. I'm looking forward to seeing this in print. So let's open it up for questions from participants. I can't see raised hands. But I can see Q&A, and I see one question. If people would type in a question to the chat, I'd be happy to read those questions and pose them to Pete and Ben. So a first question from Mohammed Idita is the following. To what extent the object or symbols used during the protest or demonstrations change the attitude of state authorities towards protesters? Could any cases be cited?
Given that I've just started talking, I'll let Pete take this one, and I can jump in at the end.
So one thing that we find really interesting to think through, but is beyond the scope of the book, we decided it was kind of beyond the scope of the book really, is to get really into differences in interpretation. It's in there, but interpretation is something that's obviously highly complicated, and interpretations of objects are very multiple and undertaken by many different actors, and so there's a great deal of research really needed on that. Basically, the reason why we thought that there's an element to which this is beyond the scope of the book at this point is that there is a need for a lot more research on that question.
Yeah.
Ben, do you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, to jump in, I mean, so obviously Pete has communicated where we try to draw the line. Like, it's on this question of kind of fundamental outcomes, because we think that we've got to get the groundwork right first. That said, you do see some situations where there is a change of attitude of state authorities, right? One of the things we see is in Valerie Zaworski's chapter, right, that certain objects really do change the way in which police see protesters. Similarly, the evidence from Eric Selbin's chapter, right, where conversely state authorities see a potential line of infiltration according to the uniformity of objects used by guerrillas in Colombia is another example. That said, the state is often very powerful here, right? It often plays a role in influencing or determining the way in which objects or symbols used during protests are interpreted. So the state is not just a recipient of symbolic objects kind of potency, it also helps to shape it. Likewise, I think sometimes you do see situations where activists make really bad mistakes, and this totally changes not just the attitude of authorities, but of audiences. So we see in Bartosz Lazarski's chapter, for example, an instance where there was a protest against loan sharks that, because of the particular materials used, was interpreted as potentially being anti-Semitic, even though that wasn't the activist's intention. And likewise, there was another instance in which attempt to protest Starbucks was accidentally interpreted by onlookers as an advertisement for the very same brand they were hoping to protest. So there definitely are cases that can be used to explore this, but we're not yet at the stage of making any grand theoretical claims about causal laws, for example.
I'll just add two more things there, actually. So one thing that we do talk about in the book is actually the limitations of symbolic objects. We think that, well, as we've said, we think that they're under-considered and under-theorized. At the same time, we're not suggesting that actually it's all about symbolic objects and they're kind of this macro causal variable that kind of overrides everything else. Like far from it. So there's kind of a need for some caution, we think, in how the kind of interpretation of symbolic objects. But just one other, so one thing just to add on to Ben's point, sometimes there are objects which can't really be interpreted, or are very difficult for state authorities to interpret, or more difficult for state authorities to interpret in a radically different way. So we can think of things like the coat hanger protests in Poland, where people brought coat hangers, and it's kind of a physical exemplification of women's experience with, under a system where abortion is illegal. And the state can try and do other things and argue, different points, but they can't really argue against the kind of physicality of the object and the meaning that is attached to it. And so I think Bartos's point as well about the strategic toolbox is an interesting one. That you can't say exactly what will happen with contentious politics in forms of protest. It's not that if you use this kind of object, you'll get this kind of outcome. It's very fluid and dynamic, obviously, but there are cases where state authorities can get around it, and cases where it's more difficult to offer an alternative interpretation.
Good, thank you. Let me see. Yes, we have another question by Erica Benyani. Thanks for this presentation. I find the work extremely interesting and fascinating, as well as important. As someone who works on contentious politics too, I was however, wondering, where do you see this work contributing to the broader field? That is, what the study of symbolic objects can tell us about the more traditional field of political protest and contention, or how can it be incorporated into the existing literature to provide better explanation of the sociology of protest? Thanks.
Great. Maybe I'll jump on this one. So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? We do have a fairly hefty section in the book about this, where if you're looking for a kind of very precise situation of where we stand on this as a position, you can find all the details in there. But answering in a kind of more accessible and casual way that everyone here, including non-contentious politics specialists, will get. Basically, we see symbolic objects appearing at this very, very important intersection of, on the one hand, the resource mobilization literature, and on the other hand, the framing literature. And what symbolic objects do is they knit this together in a very distinct, physicalized form. There's also an element of work by Sidney Tarrow on what he terms the language of contention. And we see this as kind of contributing also to that niche, right? Moving beyond just language, but also looking at symbolism more broadly. I think that there's also this kind of broader question of what we're trying to get at in the contentious politics field, full stop, right? And I think here, when we look at symbolic objects, we don't just see something which, has the potential to contribute to other areas of the study of contentious politics, but also a specific area of study that is in itself underexplored. And so what we've aimed to do is not to monopolize a field or state a particular way in which people interested in symbolic objects should or can contribute to the study of contentious politics, but rather to try and open the domain. So to kind of lay out a series of ways in which we envisage this helping complete our vision of political protest and contention. And that's not the most assertive answer, but we think that from the perspective of cultivating and developing a long-term project, we think that this will be the most fruitful for a kind of long future of study on this topic.
Yeah. So there's one thing I would just add, which really, so I've been for the past couple of years very much focused on environmental social movements, doing a lot of research with Extinction Rebellion, and one of the things that is kind of interesting to me there is around impact of a movement, how to make a movement impactful, and also impact of research. How does this literature actually help to make movements like climate-related movements more effective? And so there's a need to reflect on what social movements actors know, and they know usually, that that objects do matter and the choice of objects matter. And so I think there's a kind of need for us to really think through these things, but also to kind of, adding this into the mix of what we look at when we're trying to think about causality, trying to think about mobilization, strategy, outcomes of protests, and so on. That basically having more thought given to these kinds of decisions and what these objects do can also help to inform actors in the field as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from Ernest. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I do research in cultural processes behind protest participation, that is, frames, identities. So this is very interesting for me. Is your project fully qualitative, or is there a quantitative element, that is, to operationalize a symbolic object's potency? And what methods do you use?
Yeah, so
great question. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to continue, Pete, or shall I?
I imagine we'll say the same thing as I will, but we'll see. Go for it.
I was just going to say essentially that there's a little bit of quant in the book, but it is mostly qualitative because really what we're doing at this stage is even just trying to figure out what the variables are, right? Like we're not at the stage at which they can yet be rendered measurable because we haven't figured out the causal interactions. And so I think there's a huge amount of scope for quant studies down the line once we've got those kind of indices figured out. But at the moment we saw our greatest contribution is kind of adding theoretical and empirical texture in a kind of thick descriptive way to this particular domain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, another question from Adine O'Shaughnessy. Can you say a little more about how you theorize the effective charge or potency of symbolic objects? I know you mentioned Sarah Ahmed, but whom or what else is informing your thinking in relation to this framework?
I'll let Pete go ahead for this one.
I was going to say, Ben, do you want to take that one?
I can if you'd like. It's a long list. It's a very, very long list. I mean, wow, yeah. In the book, there are some of our theoretical influences cited, and it really is just from across the spectrum of everything from material culture through semiotics through obviously people like Sarah Ahmed to kind of work in geography. Also work by people like Michael Billig, and also work of both Tilly and Tillet as well. It really is a huge spectrum of work, and that's partly because when we wrote our theoretical framework, we did the first draft of it, we shared it with our contributors wrote their chapters as well, and we were inspired in a really kind of I'd recommend this to anyone working on edited volume, actually. Like, share your theoretical ideas with your contributors, let them write their chapters, and then when they come back, they'll have way more theoretical ideas for you. And it became a beautiful kind of melange of all of these different things. But to try and pin down individuals who've contributed, I guess the best thing I could say is if you like, I'm happy to share our bibliography, but it's so long that even I sometimes forget all of them.
Yes, and one of the things that we try to do, I guess, with the book is to be, we try to draw in scholars from quite a range of different disciplines and quite a lot of kind of interdisciplinary approaches in it. And so there are some people who are interested in, say, very semiotic approaches to that question, like Peirce and others, and then there are those like myself, like John Nagel, like Scholar Atada, whose approach really comes in from civil war and peace and conflict studies, and there's its own literature really on that, and in some ways that's kind of part of the point of the book, is to try to bridge those gaps and bring lots of different voices in. So yeah, but Nadine, like do reach out. I would be really interested to hear your thoughts as well on that.
Mhm. Okay, I will insert one of my own questions just before Sarah Plummer's question, because it kind of goes in the same way. And this is a question that comes out of classical sociology. So I'm wondering if you have considered Durkheim's classic profane sacred binary in your discussion of objects. The characteristics that he associates with the sacred as evoking ritualized behavior on the part of participants, as a sacred object of symboling or mobilizing people who adhere to them, sacred objects who are mundane, profane objects that become sacralized through an initiation process. There are other kinds of characteristics, and then there may be things that you see that Durkheim totally misses, or that this binary is not helpful. I'd be curious, and I know you could probably go in a half hour on this, maybe a brief response of that before we get to Sarah's question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
ahead.
yeah, go for it. Yeah, sure.
Just to say, it was one of our starting points, actually.
Yeah.
One of the earliest pieces of literature that was our touchstone, way back, even when we started thinking about flags, was exactly that. And so, yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It was, in many senses, a germinal text for a lot of the rest of this inquiry. It's actually one of the things where, you know, we ended up not referring it to it at great extent in the book, but in terms of its impact on our thinking, it was there at the start, and so it's had, I think, a distinctive kind of impact from the perspective of path dependency, certainly.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely, and thinking about kind of collective effervescence and you know, behaviors informed by those kinds of objects is kind of really helpful. I think there's a little bit of a potentially unhelpful dichotomy there between the sacred and profane, and you know, in some ways it's still there in our thinking, given that we're talking about symbolic objects, kind of symbolically charged things, but we don't like the idea of, we prefer to think of that as more of a continuum, and you know, things become important, and importance itself is actually open for debate, really. The kind of very strict dichotomy, you know, sort of dichotomizing profane and sacred, we find when we started writing using Durkheim that it was actually more unhelpful and restrictive in practice, really. But certainly very, as Ben said, very kind of instrumental in kind of some of our early thoughts, certainly.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Sandra Plummer. Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about the interdisciplinary aspects of your project. Do you draw on the anthropological research of Dominic Bryan, for instance, on flags and protests? Speaking as an art historian or visual cultural theorist, it was interesting to see how one of the chapter references signed objects, which have a specific meaning regarding authorship, as in art history, such as Duchamp's fountain. I'm wondering if you consider photographs or artworks of conflict as symbolic objects.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that Ben takes the second of those and I take the first. Is that right? Because yeah, absolutely. So Dominic Bryan's work was certainly really helpful, especially, you know, actually this was one of the very early texts that we looked at as well around flags in protest, because of Dominic Bryan's work on exactly that in relation to Northern Ireland. So yes, absolutely, really helpful, really interesting stuff, and we definitely do have drawn on it. I'm trying to think through the book in terms of citations. I'm sure I'd be surprised if it isn't in there. But definitely been extremely helpful. Yeah, I'd say I don't think there's very much more to say on that, but yeah, that work has definitely been helpful. But Ben, yeah, on objects.
Yeah, so on that second element, yeah, I mean, Duchamp's fountain is always a fun example, right? It's also always a fun one to refer to keep it to catch people out if they're pretending they know their stuff about art history. But in terms of the signature in particular, yeah, there's a I mean, Hunter Duke's chapter in our volume really focuses on that. In terms of photographs or artworks, yeah, absolutely. There's a few that we refer to in the book. We have some artworks as photos in the book, as well as instances. Obviously, with El Shea, similarly, right? The photograph and the artwork of El Shea are arguably even more symbolically potent than his physical body. And so absolutely, yeah, we definitely include that in our conceptualization. And one of the areas we're looking to kind of move into as we build this from, you know, a book into a kind of broader network and a research community is to talk not just to art historians and theorists of visual culture, but also to curators and people working within the museum sector, because we think that there's a lot of kind of potential for joined up thinking. There was a great exhibition actually at the Victoria and Albert a few years ago, for example, that funnily enough we didn't come across until after we'd written the book, and just coincidentally was happening at almost exactly the same time as we were thinking about these things. And so this is one of the areas we'd definitely like to expand our contributions, but it is something that has already been inspiring us, certainly.
Okay, and now a question from Sheila Killigan. Have you looked at the commercialization of cause symbols, like pink washing by putting pink ribbons on products to promote their sale, or by linking to breast cancer, etc.?
The short answer to that one is no, but I'd love to read something on that. We are thinking about putting together a special issue, as Ben said. Actually, that's the kind of thing that might be interesting to hear about, actually. But no, not particularly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, the closest I think we come is there's a little bit of discussion about the way in which the feathered headdress gets kind of commercialized and that El Shea gets commercialized, but specifically the notion of pink washing, right? The kind of adoption of symbolic objects in the deliberate service of a distinct political agenda by power holders is not something that we address in the book, but it would be a really brilliant area to expand on things. But when the book comes out, yeah, you might well be interested in the chapters on the feathered headdress, on El Shea, and potentially also on the Mech app, although that's kind of a reverse instance. But no, that'd be a fascinating thing to see more exploration of.
Good, thank you. We're out of questions at the moment, unless somebody quickly types in something. I mean, you've already answered my question on Durkheim. The question on commercialization, Durkheimian terms would be sort of kind of a process profaning the same object, presumably.
I was just thinking again about the issue of commercialization, and it's certainly a really fascinating one. But I suppose one of the things we are always trying to keep in mind with this, with our thinking around this, and for the book especially, is really keeping the focus on contentious politics itself. So something that can be really interesting is the kind of interplay there, that how things become used in or as forms of protest and other forms of contention, then become commercialized, and then how contentious political actors respond to that commercialization, trying to either undo it or expose it or react to it in some way, or even reappropriate it. So seeing the kind of interplay between commerciality and and contention would be kind of particularly interesting, I think.
I think a very good topic for your next paper.
Or someone else's, indeed. We would encourage others to explore this. And likewise, one thing I will say is, if any of this piques your interest and you want to, use it in your teaching or in your writing, or if you want to find out more about what we're doing, please do drop us a line. We're in the lucky situation that the University of Michigan Press paid for this to go fully open access, and what that means is they're not quite as worried about page proofs being out in the wild as they would otherwise be, right? Because although there are physical copies of the book available at a very affordable price, strongly recommended, etc. Likewise, it's all going to be open access anyway. So if you do want to take a look at kind of the pre-final drafts of chapters, all the page numbers are almost final, and so it will probably have something that you could read through and cite if you needed to. So do feel free to reach out to us if you want to see anything in advance. We'll be very happy to share what we can, subject to, of course, the approval of the press. But they've been very, very good with this kind of stuff so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a reminder from ECPR that a recording of this will be available on the ECPR website shortly after today. One person asked about that. So it will be there. So Pete and Ben, do you want to say a final word? I think our time is virtually up. I see no more questions. Say a final word in, I don't know, advertising the book, where you want to go from here, or something that has just occurred to you that you haven't been able to mention about this important topic thus far.
Sure. Well, just a couple of things, I suppose. I guess we've mentioned a lot of things, or these things already, but yeah, do get in touch with me and Ben if you have ideas about this stuff, or ideas about where it could go. Do keep an eye out for special issues. We both work in for Contention, Journal of Social Protest. And so yeah, do keep an eye out for those things. And another thing that we're kind of interested in talking about, and if this is you listening to this talk, we'd love to hear from you as well. Thinking about also ways that this could be applied in terms of innovative higher education pedagogical approaches. Thinking about objects and how objects can be used in the classroom as well, in teaching contentious politics and social movement studies. One other thing really quickly is to thank the ECPR for hosting us and for putting this on, and also to you, David, for hosting the talk as well, and also to everyone else for coming and for your great questions.
Yeah, I think that's hit the nail on the head there, Pete. Thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure speaking to you today.
Yes, and thank you, Pete and Ben, for providing such a interesting webinar. I think that concludes our session. Thank you all for participating and joining us, and wish you the best from Boston, or wherever you are.